the American people of the danger it constitutes. French influence has reinforced that of the communists to convince the American people that Germany should be kept disarmed and deprived of liberty and sufficient industry capacity to exist without American subsidies, a policy which must eventually succeed in forcing the Germans to side with Soviet Russia. We have not only once again imposed a crushing reparations burden on the German people. This time, we have also deprived an already overpopulated Germany of the territory without which her people cannot be fed, and of the industries which could not produce the exports with which to buy the food otherwise unobtainable. Not satisfied with having put Russia in direct control of Eastern Germany, which formerly supplied Western Germany with food, we agreed to expulsion of more than 12 million Germans from Silesia, which we gave to Poland, from the Sudetenland, inhabited by Germans for centuries past, and from Yugoslavia and other East European countries with minorities of German racial origin. If ever the history of our times comes to be written by scholars, free of national prejudice, the crimes against humanity committed by the victors of the Second World War of the 20th century AD will appear equal to those committed by the Nazis. For an objective observer, for crimes, follies, and cruelties of mankind cannot deny that expropriations and expulsions from their homes and millions of people for the sole crime of belonging to the German race was an atrocity comparable with the extermination of the Jews and the massacre of the Poles and Russians by the Nazis. The women and children who died of hunger and cold on the long trek from Silesia and the Sudetenland to what remained of the German Reich may have thought that was a quick death in a gas chamber would have been comparatively merciful. Nor will that mythical person, the historian of the future, when he comes to draw up the balance sheet between Nazi crimes and those of their conquerors, failed to register against the democracies our decision to halt our armies on the Elbe in order to allow the Red Army to sack and ravage Berlin. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, no one ever paid a higher compliment to the Nazis than their conquerors. Instead of acting according to the democratic principles we have gone to war to preserve, we tore up the Atlantic Charter and copied the Nazis in our repudiation of international law. Instead of demonstrating our belief in the Christian and liberal principles which had made America the strongest power in the world, we reaffirmed the Nazi doctrine that might makes right. Instead of showing the Germans that Hitler's racial theories were both wrong and ridiculous, we are ourselves assuming the role of a master race. Instead of establishing a rule of law according to which individuals are punished only for their crimes that they themselves have committed and only after proof of their guilt has been established, we have indicted the whole German nation for Hitler's crimes. We have told cold and hungry Germans in the cities shattered by our obliteration bombing that they could expect neither justice nor mercy, but that although we had de-enfranchised them as punishment for Nazi crimes, we would teach them to love democracy. Instead of recognizing that their unconditional surrender put us under a moral and legal obligation to ensure a fair deal for the German people. We did directly the opposite. We proclaimed at Nuremberg that we no longer considered ourselves bound by the Hague or Geneva Conventions because Germany had surrendered unconditionally. But that we would punish all Germans for having similarly disregarded international law when they were the victors. Hold up, I gotta take a break for a minute. That's what happened? There was a book called Imperium by Francis Yockey, who supposedly committed suicide in a jail in California. He didn't commit suicide, but he was an attorney at the Nuremberg trials, and he left and he got in trouble for leaving the Nuremberg trials because he disagreed with what they're doing. I bet this is what he disagreed with. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's go back to the reading. This is only the first chapter. This is a really good read. All right. We're on the 14th page at the bottom. Okay. Take a breath. She goes on to say, the original directives given to the United States occupation forces ordered them to do nothing to revive the German economy and disclaimed all responsibility for the feeding of the conquered. Although we had ourselves insisted during the war that Germany must provide enough food for the people of the countries she had occupied, however impossible this was, owing to our blockade. And it was agreed at Potsdam that the victors were entitled to exact reparations in kind in the form of forced labor, a provision taken full advantage of by the Russians, who had held millions of prisoners of war as slave laborers and conscripted men and women in their zone to work in chain gangs or concentration camps. Hold up. Wait a minute. When Japan had bombed our Pearl Harbor and we dropped the atom bomb on them, didn't we supply them with food? Didn't we rebuild their hospitals, their whole? We rebuilt everything. But we wouldn't do that for Germany? And we enslaved their people? My family, I am jaw-dropped. I am so proud of my cousin for writing this. Okay, let's go back. Page 15. I'm just having a really hard time reading this. This is hard. Let me make sure my background music is still going. My mind's reeling right now. Wow. Okay, we're... All right. She goes on to say, the soldiers of the United States were told that they were entering Germany not as liberators, but as conquerors. The task of the occupation forces was conceived of as entirely negative. It was to demilitarize, denazify, decentralize, and deindustrialize the defeated enemy country. Nothing was to be done to make the Germans believe that the victory of the democracies offered freedom, hope, or justice. Instead, we proceeded to teach the Germans that their dead Führer had been right in saying that if Germany failed to conquer, she would be destroyed. Woe to the vanquished was our motto, as it had been Hitler's. For 3 years after their unconditional surrender, we kept the Germans on rations, little or no larger than those in Nazi concentration camps. All Germans, even those who emerged from Hitler's prisons, were starved and humiliated. Germans were forbidden on pain of imprisonment to criticize the Soviet Union or complain of its inhumane treatment of those we had delivered over to the communist terror. American and German communists and fellow travelers were installed in influential positions in the military government, in the German state and town administrations, on denazification boards, and as the newspaper editors and managers of radio stations. We did our best to convince the Germans that we had no objections to tolerating doctrines and practices, so long as they served the best interests of Soviet Russia instead of those of German nationalism. We have not only made a mockery of our democratic professions by their power and influence we accorded to both America and German communists, we also taught American youth to abjure the principles the American people had been told they were fighting to preserve. American soldiers, on entering Germany, were given indoctrination courses in hatred and taught to have no mercy or pity in dealing with the wicked German race, just as the young Nazis had been taught to hate and abhor the Jews. The Montague Plan, approved of by President Roosevelt at Quebec, was the basis of the Army's notorious order JCS 1067, which laid down the pattern of our original occupation policy. The Montague Plan was for the pastoralization of Germany. Had it been carried out, would have constituted the greatest act of genocide perpetuated in modern times. The Germans would have been deprived of almost all their industries, and since their soils incapable of supporting more than the present agricultural population, at least 30 million people would have died of starvation. The humanitarian scruples of the American people prevented the execution of this infamous plan. Unfortunately, however, JSC 1067 remained as the textbook of our occupation forces until 1947. According to this Army order issued to General Eisenhower in April 1945, no steps looking toward the economic rehabilitation of Germany or designed to maintain or strengthen the German economy, end quote, were to be taken. Military government was explicitly instructed to, quote, prohibit and prevent, end quote, production in its long and comprehensive list of industries. The food consumption of the German people was to be held down to a minimum, with surpluses made available to the occupying forces and displaced persons. With a total disregard of the fact that a Germany deprived of its eastern breadbasket by the Russian occupation and by the Polish seizure of Silesia had no possibility of feeding herself even at near starvation level, it was decreed that the ration scale should be set low enough to permit the use of net surpluses for the substance of the occupation forces and displaced persons and for export. Army Order JCS 1067 explicitly states that Germany will not be occupied for the purpose of liberation, but as a defeated enemy nation. It went on to say that reparations and restitutions were to be exacted, and no political activity permitted. Fraternization with the enemy was strictly forbidden. We were determined to out-Nazi the Nazis in our own treatment of the conquered. American soldiers were threatened with punishment should they behave like Americans and aid the destitute and helpless. Kindness, even to German children, was held to be a misdemeanor. GIs were forbidden to take a morsel of food off their plates to give to the starving, and mess sergeants were instructed to throw away food left over, not to let any Germans have it. Even the gift of coffee grounds to the Germans was forbidden. Not only was charity forbidden and pity regarded as un-American, GIs and officers if not positively